What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Ex Nihilo podcast. It's me, Eddie, back with you again. And I've got a special guest. Every now and then we talk about things of the mind. Talk about things of the body. We talk about things of the spirit. Really, we're going to focus on the mind here today. And there's tremendous bleed over, but I think there's such a prevalence. And we've talked about the pharmaceutical industry. We've talked about big food. We've talked about all these different elements. And I think Dr. Roger McFillin is going to help sort of bring all these things together for us. Dr. Roger McFillin, he's a clinical psychologist. He's also the founder of Conscious Clinician Collective. And he's the host of Radically Genuine podcast, which I've really enjoyed. You've got to go listen in if you haven't so far. Doctor, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. It's an honor to be with you. Can't wait to get into some of these important topics.
For sure. Now, you're a psychologist, and you appear critical of your field. I mean, I think that's obvious. I think you lead with that, and I think that's great. I guess the question, though, for like us regular people is why? Like, plenty of psychologists kind of just go with the status quo. Why are you so critical of your own field?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's my responsibility to do so. When I reflect back on kind of the education system that exists in the United States, we're really trained to be adherent to rules, memorization. It really sets up a system where authority is something that there's a lot of deference to, and so I don't think there's a lot of critical analysis and critical thinking in the American educational system, as evidenced by where we look at our current medical system and the health of our country. I mean, we are a sick country by every measurable statistic, and so the same thing applies to mental health. Of course, if you've been following trends, if you're observing what's going on in American and Western societies, we see this continued uptick of statistics that represent deteriorating mental well-being and mental health. How is that measured? Well, that's measured by people identifying themselves to be in depressive episodes, identifying with psychiatric diagnoses. There's an increase in suicide. There's an increase in non-suicidal self-injury, substance abuse, and the manner in which we respond to mental health, the way we talk about it, the way we quote unquote treat it, in my opinion, actually creates more harm than it does good. And I think I have good data to support that. So I'm in a field that when I look at the outcomes, I see there are more and more people that are accessing mental health services, and I see more and more people being unwell or becoming chronic patients. So like really identifying as mentally ill. And we promote this too. We promote this in ways and talk about it in our culture in ways that never have previously. Obviously there's a large social media component to it. We're seeing young people attaching to diagnoses. Interestingly enough, we're actually seeing trends where people are seeking out the diagnosis and having a desire to be on psychiatric drugs. So obviously I want to step back.
Wow.
And I want to observe that cultural trend and say, what is happening here? Because, traditionally speaking, the last thing you'd want to identify with in life is being mentally ill or unstable. Right?
You would think.
You'd want to build a trust and a connection to people. You'd want to achieve. There's something in our spirit, there's in our souls that drives for more. So getting attached to this idea, which is an inner label of our own minds, to this idea that we're unwell or sick, I'm interested in what are the ramifications of that? What are the downstream consequences? What does standard mental health care look like? Well, it's kind of been reduced to therapy and a drug. How did that happen?
Wow.
Right? So I tried to examine what's the literature to support that. What are the messagings that have been communicated to the American public that suggests that's your path to wellness, is going to talk to somebody under an umbrella term called psychotherapy, and then this range of pharmaceuticals that are being prescribed at rates higher than they've ever been, that have significant health effects, adverse health effects, that have very poor efficacy outcomes in clinical trials, that have a lot of poor safety data, and then we're mixing them with drugs that have never been evaluated, and we're giving it to younger and younger people. So the long-winded answer to your question is, how can I not be critical of that approach? When you see that people are getting worse, and all statistics show it, and we're in a system where people aren't getting accurate information about what their choices are, even how to think about what their experience is like to be a human being, like the trials, tribulations, things that have been written about and passed down from generations cross-culturally in biblical texts, in traditional texts. Like, life is hard, life is a challenge, and
Right.
how we respond to those challenges and that outcome is, how we identify with that general term, mental health. So I think there's a lot to critically examine.
Yeah, I mean, that was succinct. I mean, you laid it out perfectly. I do have to ask that there's a few things you mentioned that sort of I raise flags. So first, a lot of people will say COVID is largely the reason where this sort of the prevalence, I guess, maybe the mainstream culture of like, I'm on an antidepressant, I'm going to therapy. And I've seen that too, like anecdotally in my life, but also just as a pastor and online, I've seen this happen. Do you think COVID plays a massive role in this, or is this sort of like maybe a magnifying glass on something that was already happening?
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. It's a magnifying glass on a problem that we see was trending in that direction. Certainly, the effect that it had on younger people with isolation and what we did in schools certainly exacerbated it. But you see this upward trend really since when we started introducing pharmaceuticals to the picture in the 1990s. We're one of 2 countries that have direct to consumer advertising around pharmaceuticals. And so, yes, we see the commercials on TV, but one of the things we don't talk about is how it is pushed on television, in movies, magazine covers. And it's communicated that, like, if you're struggling emotionally in any way, the internal experiences of intrusive thoughts or memories or painful emotions, something that is quite typical and normal to be in a human body throughout the course of a lifetime, now starts getting articulated as if there's something wrong with key neurochemicals in your brain. So this is like this push to say that there's like these chemical imbalances of brain chemicals, and therefore taking care of your mental health is similar to taking care of another medical condition that's clearly identifiable. And this was a marketing push by the pharmaceutical companies. They aligned themselves with mainstream medical establishment in the psychiatric industry. And it was a way to legitimize like psychiatry and mental health as if it's a real medical disorder. And so what we've abandoned in there is like the language of suffering, how to cope, how to respond, how to build resilience. And we started fragilizing people as if they're vulnerable, sick, and mentally ill, and they have to externalize it by going to a doctor or going to a therapist. So it like alters what is naturally within us. And, I believe we are extremely resilient people. And human beings over the course of time had to go through famine and war and loss and challenges. And, if you're a Christian or you're anyone who's spiritually inclined, you are a soul within a human body experiencing this for reasons of soul expansion and growth.
Yeah.
And the pain of living has been written about, dating back to the dawn of written word and of communication. We've lost kind of that generational passing down of stories and myths and metaphors that help people articulate the complexity of living life and the pain that comes with it. So we're stripping people of the language of suffering, community that comes along with people who are struggling, like family and church and connection within our community, and we're outsourcing it. Have you gone to a therapist? Maybe you should go see a doctor about that. And it's creating this relationship that I think it's new. I think it's a modern construction, this relationship to our own experience where we're actually now fearful of it. Like people are scared of their own thoughts. They're scared of their own emotions, which if you're going to create a psyop on how to create a fragile population who is adherent to authority and rules and is fear-based, you would do just that. You would create fear of their own internal experience. See, I think emotions are gifts. I think emotions are divinely, placed for us as signals to pay attention to, and we use them to manifest and construct that into change in our life. So I talk about emotions as energy. I talk about emotions as something that is provided to us for our benefit. Some of it's for survival, but also it's for our own spiritual growth, that when we face these challenges that exist in our life, We want to pay attention and become very emotionally intelligent and literate and understand and face those emotions to serve us. So when we have an entire system that talks about emotions as if they're symptoms of some disease state, I can tell you right away that that doesn't fit any paradigm which is going to serve people's resilience and serve people being able to overcome challenges in their life.
Yeah, I mean, wow. This is fantastic. This is mind-blowing stuff. I mean, I love your expertise here, and it's doing a couple things. It's speaking to what's happening prevalent in culture, but it's not just a cultural phenomenon like, people dislike, we don't like snowflakes, you're too sensitive. It's not just that. It's also that people aren't able to, like, I love the word resiliency. We're not building resiliency. We're not, suffering and growing in the suffering and building up that tolerance level. There's a lot of mechanisms happening. And you brought up the pharmaceuticals, marketing to the commercials. Is the other country New Zealand? Am I totally wrong? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So if the United States can market their antidepressants or SSRIs or to directly to the public, they can frame them up however they need to frame them up without, as you say, this isn't, it's not cut and dry as to whether or not these things actually work. And so if they're able to do that, they can kind of market it however they need to. And I'll just point it out. Like I've watched some of these antidepressant commercials, and they're kind of eerie. They're kind of freak me out a little bit. Like, everything's black and white, and then you're depressed, and then they light up, and then everything kind of looks kind of creepy, and you're playing in the yard, and then they say like, may lead to suicidal thoughts. And I think like this feels very Vanilla Sky, Tom Cruise to me. Like it kind of freaks me out. I mean, are you seeing that same thing, or am I overplaying this?
No, it's kind of dystopian in a lot
of
ways.
That's the word I'm looking for.
Like the world is black and white, and take this drug and the color returns, right? And the way they communicate, it's like you have this disease, and if you take this drug, depression, obviously it's a deficiency of Prozac, and you take Prozac, and now you're just color returns to your life and all the problems that led to it. Everything about who you are in your life doesn't matter. You have this magic, which is complete lies. I mean, it's complete being sold to us, but the narrative is very powerful. You even use language. Like, how powerful is language? Antidepressant, right? Like it's an antibiotic. I take this and I can no longer feel sad, or it's a happy pill now. So people create these images of what this drug actually is that by no means fits the data at all. There's no such thing as an antidepressant drug. There's drugs that change the way you feel. Smoking weed can change the way you feel. Drinking alcohol can change the way you feel. We don't call those antidepressants. Like if you have people, drink a lot when they have social anxiety. They go out, they drink, it lowers their inhibitions, they can socialize. But we don't call that an anti-anxiety, medicine. It's alcohol is a drug, and so is an SSRI. And an SSRI has varying differences in impact from person to person. It's never antidepressant. So don't get that out there. It never relieves depression, but it can numb people out. It can create a detachment or a distance from their own experience. It never creates happiness. It might create mania. We have all these range of negative health effects. The ones that are most concerning are the ones that are deadly. So like there's at least a double increase in the likelihood of a suicide event when you start taking it. From my exposure to the literature, I think it's about a 4 to 6 times increase in suicide. It can alter your thoughts, your emotions. It increases, homicide. It changes who people are. It changes relationships. It's an altering brain chemistry that affects every aspect of the body. And, one thing that's really important, I say it every time I get onto a podcast, is people have to know that the whole chemical imbalance marketing push was a lie. There's no scientific support to it. Depression isn't related to low serotonin. So you're artificially and manipulating key neurochemicals in your brain, and you're creating a chemical imbalance, and there's a lot of downstream, effects to that. But I'm concerned about the psychological component of this, is that we're communicating to people that there's some easy, response to your struggle. And we're not saying that, hey, your emotions make sense given what you're going through, what has happened to you or what is happening internally, and there's a safe way out. There's a way that you can grow
Right.
through this. We can discuss this as transformational. When you discuss it as a disease, then you're always seeking the solution outside of you. When you talk about it as a transformational experience, you understand that not only can you tolerate that pain, but that pain can also benefit you, or this is designed to move you in a new way in your life. And that's kind of the saddest thing that I see when people enter into the psychiatric system, is they'll come in to me and they might have some legitimate problems in their life, maybe problems they have to face in relationships, or from their family history, or the way they view themselves. And they think that taking the pill like alters who they are and they'll just feel good. And it never does. It doesn't provide that. All it is going to create some form of drug dependence and long-term problems, because it's never just one drug. It's always increasing that dose, and then it's adding another, and then adding another. And now you're polypharm drugged, never dealing with the initial problems that that occur. And so what I like about what we were talking about before we got in here is that we have to understand that being well in this life has multiple components, right? It's what you put into your body. It's the way you live. It's your purpose. It's your meaning. It's the quality of your relationships. It's the sleep that you have. Are you at peace? Are you connected spiritually to something bigger and greater than you? What is your purpose for here on this earth? Why are you here? Because that's what gets you through difficult times. If there's no meaning attached to struggle or suffering, that's when I see people falling into very dark places. So obviously this is something that is multifactorial. It's complex. It deserves the complexity of those discussions. I'm not denying that struggle exists, obviously. I'm not denying that mental health problems exist. What I'm speaking out against is how we conceptualize it and then how we go about treating it. And we've medicalized all aspects of living at this point. So now we're identifying with any challenge that exists, and you're somehow diseased and your only solution is allopathic medicine. And obviously that's created mass harm. And this is an inflection point in American culture. There has to be a wake up. The one thing that's come from COVID, in my opinion, is that the blessing through all this is we've kind of peeked behind the curtain. The veil has been lifted about corruption and intentional poisoning of the American population, poisoning of the American mind. And I'm hopeful that there can be change with a new administration who are, talking about the corruption, the capture of our regulatory bodies and the FDA and Health and Human Services, the CDC. There's so many opportunities that exist for us as a culture that arise out of the pandemic and rise out of our struggle. But we have to have conversations to talk about, what that looks like. And what does it look like on an individual basis or on a cultural basis, is that this is an opportunity for us to reshift how we actually think about what it means to live, to struggle, to support each other. And those can only be done with the critical analysis, asking those difficult questions about what has become mental health, because we've commodified it. It's become big business now.
It's a little bit terrifying as you say it to know what's happened, but then you peek, hey, maybe potentially this future administration can provide some hope. This sort of reconfiguring the entire system for what's happened, because commodifying people's state of well-being and saying, hey, you need my product in order to feel less depressed or less anxious. That feels, I guess the only word I can think of, and maybe it's because I'm a pastor, is it feels demonic. It feels, it's definitely taking advantage of people. It's definitely making a profit off of what people believe is true. To speak to the fragility of it all, I'm sure you've seen this, but here at the University of Washington in Seattle, they've got post-election, they've got rooms for college students to go in, to cry in, and to there's coloring books and milk and muffins for them to cope with what's happening. And it feels as if we are at an incredibly fragile point. And to your point, it's okay, well, let's get you in with a therapist. Let's get you in talking to someone. Let's get you on your back and walk through the trauma you've experienced of experiencing Donald Trump as your president. And that just doesn't feel, and maybe you tell me, but to me, that doesn't feel all that traumatic. It feels like maybe what is trauma exactly? And I guess maybe that's the next question for you is, I hear a lot about trauma today. It's like my boss yelled at me. I've experienced trauma. what is trauma, and is that something we need to take seriously in today's society?
Yeah, it's certainly become a watered down term, hasn't it? Where now we talk about it with any aspect of discomfort or disappointment is now, traumatic. And so this is where language is really important. Like, I don't understand how I can use that word and apply it to someone's disappointment on who wins in a democratic election, or getting a C on a test, or maybe not making a team. Challenges, difficult things that you might have to face in life. But when somebody's been horribly raped at gunpoint, or a serviceman sees their best friend shot and killed right in front of them, and we use the same word to describe both situations, that does people a disservice. Not only does it discount the challenges of the person who's gone through something so severe and life-altering, but we're also then fragilizing the person who can't even deal with normal life events. To me, there's some brainwashing, psyop, purposeful, intentional aspect of fragilizing the American public, because when you become that fragile, you become easily controlled, manipulated, and then dependent on authority. You learn this through psychological experiments. I'm sure they've learned it through MK Ultra. You learn that what can you do to manipulate somebody and to control them. Well, one way to manipulate and control somebody is you make them dependent on the authority. You completely fragilize them. You put them in a place of fear, and fear is what can control you. And so I do think when you talk about, the demonic aspect, there has always been and always will be a battle between fear and love, right? And that's kind of what we're experiencing energetically, right? It is fear that allows us to harm our fellow man. It is fear that leads us to not rise up against injustice, or to speak our minds, or to take care of people when we need to take care of people. When you look at 80% of Americans took the COVID vaccine, which was a novel mRNA gene therapy that hasn't been evaluated long term. The only way you can do that is blind trust on the authority. And you do that in a state of fear. And that's what happened. And it was a testing ground for how the American public can respond to fear. And a lot of people failed, and we struggled, and you saw the impact. Now I think there's a resurrection from all that. And then when we think about, well, what is love? Love encompasses an energy that includes courage, that includes facing our own fears, overcoming them and getting strong in the process, taking care of each other, forgiveness. There's so many positive healing energies to love, and then there's so many aspects of fear that will really debilitate you, and is debilitating. It'll debilitate you mentally, it'll debilitate you physically. And before you know it, that's when you're in a disease state. Your body is not at ease. You're under constant stress. And that's where we don't talk about mental health. We don't talk about it in terms of energy and how to face that fear and to overcome it. We're talking about it in terms of you are being sick. That's a consciousness that's being created. You're sick, you're ill, you're broken. Think about all the messages that are constantly placed on us in our society about, watch out, this bad thing's going to happen, this next thing's going to happen. You turn on the news, you're going to be chronically sick. You're going to be chronically mentally sick, because all they want to do is provoke fear. And then you enter into the medical system, you get this test, you get this evaluation, but what about this? This bad thing can happen to you as well. You have to make sure you get it. You have to get checked here, and you have to go see the doctor, every year. And it's this big system of consciousness of fear provocation. And that's where we've fallen as a nation. And in a lot of ways, not only are we divided purposely based on race, culture, socioeconomic status, religion, belief, your party affiliation, that provokes fear, because it provokes fear of the other, right? Our own fellow man becomes the enemy. And don't think that stuff's not purposeful and it doesn't tie into then, okay, now you're fragile, now you're fear, go see the doctor. Go take this pill. Pills that are not evaluated, pills that create all types of problems, that alter your brain chemistry on levels that make you detached and despondent. So I look at it.
Yeah.
I look at it spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
I also look at it from a level of totalitarian control and government control
Wow.
and intervention, because that has been the history of human nature. That's the way it has always been. And there's an awakening to this, and the
Mm-hmm.
positive is that we can see it now more clearly, and
Yeah,
we're not
that's true.
under that same mind control. And
That's true.
I think we rise up in courage, and we rise up in love to be able to speak out against injustice, and we speak out against harm.
This is really meta, and it's speaking to a lot of, I think, what the sentiment of what people are, I think, experiencing and feeling. I do want to call attention to the fact that, hey, there are lots of people that are using SSRIs, and I'd love to get your opinion on this. I know you know them. People come up and they're like, hey, well, I take whatever brand it is, and I was depressed or I was anxious, and I no longer am, and I think I feel better. Is there any? First of all, maybe what is an SSRI and what is it supposed to do? Second, is there any evidence they work? And then what about these sort of anecdotal stories of people saying they have success? Like, are those true? Are they having success or not?
Yeah, great question. So let's start with what an SSRI is. It's called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which just basically means it's a chemical compound made in a factory that's designed to increase the availability of serotonin in the nerve cell. That's a chemical messenger. There's a period of time where, in our history, where it was questionable whether if you could, alter certain brain chemicals, it changes, your emotional states, which there's some truth to it, right? Any type of drug that you have alters brain chemicals, right? You drink alcohol, food alters brain chemicals, thought alters brain chemicals, alcohol alters brain chemicals. Yes, all these are true to a degree.
Right.
But it was, sold to the American public as this is a permanent solution to something that is like genetically problematic. All right, so here, what do we know about clinical trials? God, I know way too much about this, Eddie. I became obsessed on this topic for about 5 or 6 years. I would question if there's another human being on Earth who has more knowledge about this subject right now. I've got a lot of knowledge that I wish I didn't have, actually, and I had too many podcast conversations. All right, so a clinical trial, how do these drugs get approved? They get approved by, you need to have 2 positive trials to outperform placebo, okay? And so you do randomized controlled clinical trials, which means you're supposed to have blinded groups that don't know if they're getting the drug or they're getting the placebo, and the researchers shouldn't know either. And then you use some tests and measurements. You only need 2 positive trials. One of the things that the drug companies knew very, very early is that their drug was not defeating placebo. So what that means is that the placebo groups in the SSRI trials were getting better. Right? So when you ask yourself the question that some people take an SSRI and they get better, well, there's truth to this, because first of all, a number of things could be happening. First, most depressive episodes or struggles are episodic to begin with. Like, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. Like, everything's temporary. Like, we can reflect on our own lives. We go through tough times. We naturally get better without any intervention.
Right.
So, that's a thing. But when somebody takes a drug and they're told it's antidepressant, there's a powerful idea that's created. And so when people took the sugar pill and they believed that they took the antidepressant, they actually report greater improvement. And so the beliefs are really, really powerful. Like, if you believe there's something wrong with you and, a doctor has a pill for it, you can get better. That's the placebo effect. And so we see really strong responses of placebos in mental health. That's the power of the mind. So there's a lot of people who take the drug, feel better automatically. It has nothing to do with the drug. In fact, I would tell you, we have no evidence that the drug outperforms the placebo. The only reason it's on the market is because complete corruption. So here's what has to happen. Excuse me?
Like, at all? Like, no evidence?
There is no person, no reasonable, conscious, ethical person can look at the data and say the drug is something that creates an effect. And look, it's taken a long time for me to say it this clearly, but I am so clear about this that there's no doubt, right? Now, a drug changes the way you feel. So there's something called an amplified placebo effect. So let's say someone takes the drug and there's a numbness. Most people know they took the drug, so blind is being broken. So you combine the belief plus the pill and the fact that it changes your physiology. People will identify that as, oh, I am feeling better. But again, it's not clinically meaningful in comparison to a placebo effect. Here's what the drug companies had to do in order to get Prozac approved by the FDA. So there were people that were becoming suicidal on the drug. There were people that were having what's called a stimulating effect. They were becoming manic. So there were people that were worsening on the drug. They took those people out of the trial and reported them not as becoming suicidal. They would report them as like increased lability or worsening depression. Sometimes they wouldn't even report it. And they do something called placebo washing. In order to get a statistical difference between the drug group and the placebo group, they would put people in the placebo group who were already on a drug, and they would abruptly get them to stop it and put them in withdrawal. So now they're doing worse because they're in drug withdrawal. And now when you do the assessments, you can see a difference between the group that's not in drug withdrawal and the group that is. Additionally, what you do in placebo washing is you run an initial trial, and you see who the people are who responded to the placebo group, and you take them out of your trial, and the ones who didn't respond to the placebo, you keep them in and you make them the placebo group. So there are people who are more susceptible to a placebo response, stronger belief systems. What I hypothesize is there are people who believe that there's something broken within them medically, and they seek everything externally through the medical system. Those people are more likely to respond to a placebo drug because they're getting a pill. So the bottom line is this: there's no antidepressant drug in a just, ethical, scientifically safe environment. The drug would have never been approved because the drug has a whole lot of problems associated with it. And then how it's really dealt with in American culture is people are usually prescribed multiple drugs. You might be on Adderall, you might be on an SSRI, and they might add another one. None of those things are evaluated. You are playing Russian roulette with brain chemistry. And so what do you see? You see things like that we've seen in American culture since we started pushing these drugs. We've seen violence in forms of like school shootings, things we've never seen before. We've seen mass murders. I've had to do some consulting with like young people who were placed on like 5 or 6 psychiatric drugs and then committed a crime and don't remember it. And providing them some research evidence to say, hey, listen, this is a drug effect. The drugs do these things. Yeah. And so we have a huge drug problem that people are viewing as their solution to feeling better. And the drug companies and popular culture has done such a good job of like glorifying this, that like people actually now view as if they're taking like an SSRI, that it somehow validates their struggles and they have a real disability, and it justifies like why they might be falling short in one area or why they're struggling in relationships. And there's almost becoming this very strange like addiction to a label to define who they are, and it becomes part of their personality and like their developing identity. I'm someone who struggles with my mental health becomes who they are in all aspects of their life, and they use it for like justifications on so many things. It's integrated into our culture in such a way that it's a typical conversation in evaluations that I do. I'm a practicing psychologist and I own a large center. And so we do a lot of evaluations, and we see like mental health problems being the justification for a lot of different things that aren't quite normal. There are just normal trials and tribulations for growing up, for being like an adolescent or a young person. Listen, you go through a lot of trials and tribulations. You have breakups. You might struggle in a course. You might struggle in friendships, and that provokes shame and their struggle. And then we respond to that shame through learning and adapting. But now we're using, like, people are saying, "Well, I have ADHD. That's why I said that," or I'm too anxious to do that class report, that oral class report. It has become this justification. Your emotional state has become a justification for not doing things, and that's part of the medicalization of our of our culture, and that's why it's been adopted to the manner which it is, especially when you're pushing identity politics and you're dividing people, and you're telling people if you have success in life, it's not because of your innate talent or your hard work. It's because of like your inborn characteristics or what you were born into this life with, and that's that's kind of that Marxist cultural conditioning that has infiltrated us to such an extent in this woke culture that speaks to the fragilization of so much of this current generation. We should be very concerned about the future of our country because there's way too many people who struggle to deal with the day-to-day of life, and they attribute it to something that they have no control over, and that is sad. And
Yes.
And that's demonic.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it sounds like, I mean, in layman's terms, that was so well put, but I'll just add my 2 cents. It seems like we have a culture that's training people to become victims. And so therefore, whatever happens to us in this world, whether it's external or it's internal, we're not in control of it. And so, there's nothing you can do. And so we need to feel sympathy. We need to feel empathy for you. And also, here are a load of pharmaceuticals that you can also take to make yourself feel better. But you're completely a victim. And the common knowledge, there's a lot of common knowledge that would say that when you decide to be a victim, it takes away your power to change. And as someone who's, I know you've counseled some people that have experienced a lot of trauma. My mom passed away when I was 13. I grew up in a really bad neighborhood. I grew up getting beat up, get our house broken into. My dad left our family when I was really young. I've experienced a harder life, but I also believe that if I were to stay a victim and say, man, this is hard, there's nothing I can do about this, like, what do I do? Then I wouldn't be where I am today, and I wouldn't try to build a resilient life, and I wouldn't try to build resilient children to say, bad things are going to happen. And let me step out even more spiritually. I think there's a sense in which human beings, especially in a world without like this transcendent purpose you speak of, this God you speak of, that they're searching for reasons as to why the world is so hard, why it's so broken, why it's so what I would call sinful, and they're interacting with a broken and harsh world, and they don't know how to put words to it, and so they're trying to cope with a sinful, broken world, their own sinful, broken heart, their own broken communities, their own broken families, and they don't know what to do. And then in creeps sort of like big pharma and economics and going, hey, we'll take advantage of that. And so there's this like crescendo of like all of these different variables that I would just call brokenness of the world, the depravity of mankind. And we're sort of left with like this, like you said, this sort of woke, broke, fragile culture that feels really sad and has been taken advantage of. And I guess when you hear someone like of your stature say, man, SSRIs don't work, that can feel really hopeless for a lot of people. What do you suppose people do instead? Like, what's the first step? Like, how do they find help then?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. That question gets asked to me all the time, and it's fascinating that we're at a point where, the question is, well, if people can't take an SSRI, well, then how do they get help?
That's true.
As if, like, throughout all of human history, people didn't, survive or overcome, or stories like yourself, Eddie. Like, so let's reflect on kind of your own personal story a little bit. Obviously, you had to go through so much pain and hardship during those experiences in your life, and here you are today. You have a successful career. You've found God. You're serving family, you're serving people, you're on a podcast, you're a professional athlete. Something within you, there was a fire that was lit, that through those experiences, you became strengthened in some ways. So the ultimate sin to me is the denial of God. I see God in everything. I see God even in the pain in your story, because what happens is when a culture becomes disconnected from the divine, when it comes disconnected from what is greater than ours, there's a spiritual emptiness that occurs, and we label that emptiness as depression. We label it with all these clinical words, but the process is still the same. Is the person is seeking out God in something. They're seeking out direction in something. So what happens when you seek out God in the politician, or you seek out God from the medical professional or from the pharmaceutical? The same thing's always going to happen. It's going to be the same path. That's never going to fill your cup. That's never going to provide you with the peace and the purpose and the love that you're seeking, right? You're going to be continuously searching for something that you're never going to find. And when people come to me and they're struggling, there's a reason, there's a story, right? And there's a connection that happens, right? A human being who is caring, who's listening, and wants to know your story. That's what I love about my job. It's the best part of my job, is the human story of struggle and resilience is so powerful. And that's my drug. Like I really am interested in people, and when they get to tell their story, and you have someone who's really hearing it and listening and doesn't see them as broken, actually sees them as like a child of God who's incredibly strong, and everything that has happened, there can be meaning attached to it, and there can be something greater on the other side, which to me is the story of the resurrection. And that story exists in a lot of different cultures outside of the Christian faith. That those trials, those tribulations, we fall down, even our seasons, like, there's a shedding, there's a dying, and there's a rebirth. And so the spirit in the rebirth that occurs is we have a tendency to pathologize the death part, the shedding part, the changing, right? We are never the same. We can only live in the now. That's the powerful thing. Like, I think, we're internal souls, we're internal beings, but we only exist in the eternal now. Here is our now. So this conversation can only be the most important thing, because that's all that exists. So when people tell their stories and they experience that energy and those emotions, the sadness, the loss, the depth, the fear, those emotions are valid responses to what they've gone through or what they're going through internally. And so part of my job is to get them to see it that way, to change a new relationship with their emotional experiences. And they have them. And there's learning that can be done. Even in the depths of darkness, there is learning and growth. All right. And then there's always the what's next, because you live in the now. Right. So Eddie, even if that when those things happen to you, loss, being abandoned, violence, a difficult neighborhood, and all other challenges, they are not in the now. So those have already actually occurred. Now, human beings have a way to relive that. In some ways, we can get addicted to it, like the chemical process of that anger and that hurt and that trauma. And then we can recreate it in the now in our relationships. If we don't see it, and if we don't understand the patterns, and then we don't understand that we're getting addicted to our own stress, and learn to live fully and passionately in the now, then we're just going to create the same challenges over and over and over again. And what if I told you I thought that was purposeful? That we're going to continue to create the same challenges until we overcome them, because that's what you're designed to do. You're going to grow, and your soul's going to expand, and you're going to learn from overcoming it. So when I talk about these conditions that we label as mental illness, I label them as transformational, as opportunities. Do you think my outcomes are better than the typical therapist who wants to view you as sick with a mental illness and go take a pill and just talk to me every week? Yeah, my outcomes are going to be much, much better, because there's going to be, a process of tremendous growth. Now, that person is understood and cared for, and there's obviously a safe place where they can be, talk about what they've gone through, which is their natural resiliency. Like, you have to process that. Like, you have to go through that in some way. You got to feel that. You got to face that. Now, when you have somebody who's there, who's validating and understands it and sees it from a different lens, I think it facilitates that process. But there's still always the accountability of who are you now, right? Because that happened to you doesn't give you permission to do it to somebody else. It doesn't put you, if it puts you in a victim mindset, which it can easily, you can develop a mindset that the world will always be against you. Now, that's a reality that you're creating. And so part of my job is to be able to get people to observe their internal realities that they're creating. They're powerful creators. We are all powerful creators. And that's the freedom that really does exist. Yeah. So obviously it's complicated, and so people go through so many different things. Sometimes I get them when they've already destroyed themselves. Maybe it's drugs, maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's an eating disorder. Maybe they're on the brink of, questioning whether they want to live or die. And so, I got to see the way that they're responding to their pain and give them new ways to respond to that pain and try to inspire hope. But I just don't think, like, just because I'm a psychologist doesn't mean I myself am trained to naturally do that. Part of that feels like I didn't learn this in school. It just comes naturally to me. So like you can, I think, like Eddie, you could do this. Like you can create this for people. Like that's my problem is that we've limited everything to the mental health or the medical system. But what about community? What about mentors? What about our pastors? What about loved ones? What about mentorship? What about elders in communities? Because that's how traditionally we've healed. That's how we've grown. Stories, eldership, mentorship, people pushing you. There were probably coaches that pushed you who were father figures, right? And they saw something in you, and that was your therapist, right? Like that was the meaningful relationship that got you to see you, that you have value and that you have purpose. So these are the conversations that I want to have that we don't have with the mental health labels and the psychiatrist's prescription.
It's all gotten so sterile, and it really does make me sad. I had a former therapist say to me, you just recite this over and over and just talking about being present. It happened to me, and it's over. And being able to understand that I don't need to like relive the traumatic events of my past, and I can live in the now. It gave me courage to press on and everything you're talking about. And I really do hope that, and I think it's a funny call out. I laughed when you first said it. It was a while ago now, but yeah, it's funny that people say like, well, what do I do now if I can't take an SSRI? And it's like, yeah, like for thousands of years, people figured out how to answer that question. And now all of a sudden we're sort of trained like rats on a wheel that we don't, like, there's no solution. We don't have a solution without Big Pharma. And that does make me sad. So therapy is an important part of this. Community is an important part of this. But specifically about therapy, I mean, there does seem like coming out of COVID, there was this sort of coupling. I mean, maybe it's always been like this. You tell me. But with the pharmaceutical and get a therapist. But like I hear people talking in therapist languages, like in therapist language nonstop right now, and it is like it's almost like kind of getting annoying that everyone is speaking in this like therapy lingo vernacular. Is therapy it sounds like therapy could be the right option, potentially, depending on who it is. Is that the right way? And there's also bad therapy out there.
Yeah, I hate that therapy lingo, that therapy speak. I mean, I get a strong like vomit reaction to it. Like it's so inauthentic, right?
Yeah.
It's so like rehearsed. And you see, it's like these therapists are coming off the assembly line, trained the same pop culture nonsense over and over and over again. And you're embedding all these ideas, and it's certainly this like level of brainwashing to an extent I could have never predicted in my field. All right, so psychotherapy, like anything, it's a way of intervening with somebody, and there's time and there's place and there's conditions and there's ways in which it can yield a positive effect and really help people. And in the same regard, it can create harm. So first of all, I believe most people shouldn't be in therapy, right? I think it should be for a select few of people who are really stuck. They might and don't know how to get out of it. They might not have the awareness of how to get. They're in a lot of pain. They're responding automatically. There are some like conditions, right? Like that are really real. Like we put these labels on it, but post-traumatic stress disorder is a very legitimate and debilitating condition. People can get horribly depressed. Fear can consume people. Obsessive compulsive disorder can be really, really impairing. People can get stuck in their minds, become obsessive, and develop patterns of relating to that fear over and over again. I work with people who are bulimic. I work with people who certainly are in the aftermath of some traumatic incidents, and they're consumed by the memory and the fear of that. So, certainly there's like some real established ways of like working with people that are well studied and well versed, and there are experts in delivering that. And I think that can be effective. They tend to be much more short term than what we talk about in our culture. You hear this like people are going to therapies for like years. They're high functioning, and it's like they run every problem by their therapist, as if it's become a pseudo friendship, and like it has to be run by them for like permission on how to like make major decisions in their life. And my personal belief on that kind of stuff is it undermines their own autonomy, right? And that's just creating dependency. That's not that's not facilitating somebody's like natural abilities to face life and seeing them as a resilient being capable of amazing things. No, that's like creating an environment where you can get income every week. So I'm concerned about that. The other thing I'm concerned about with modern therapy and therapists, which a lot of them I feel like they're younger now, they're not really trained with a lot of depth. They're kind of pushed into this model of diagnosis and a talk therapy and what they're exposed to on like TikTok. Like I literally hear like young therapists who were interviewing, they're like using terms that are like pushed on TikTok or by influencers. Like, so cultural lexicon about, what people are kind of going through. Like, I hate that, like my anxiety or my ADHD, like it's like something you own, right? Like
that's so weird. That bothers me so much when people do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like my trauma or my trauma is preventing me from doing this, or every reaction, like all this overanalyzation of every little experience that goes on in your mind and your emotions has to be somehow like verbalized to everybody. And I say, like, where your attention goes, your energy is going to flow. I just put something out on Twitter. I think focusing on your mental health is harmful. Do people know what I'm talking about? And I got some of the best responses. Yes, I know what you're talking about. Because the people who are doing well in life, they know that their attention needs to be focused on the things that are most meaningful, right? So they're generally serving others, or there's something that they're passionate about, and they're focused in out of life. When people are focused in on themselves all the time, it tends to drive misery. And the thing about bad therapy is that you can collectively, a therapist and a client, create a reality together. That reality could break up marriages. That reality can victimize you. Because, the one thing that you have to be humble about as a therapist or psychologist is you're hearing somebody's story. Their carefully constructed story about their own life. And it's filtered. They're picking and choosing what they're going to be sharing with you.
That's true.
And poor therapists take everything that is said as if it's gospel and then respond to it and create another narrative around it. And before you know, you got more and more people living in their own heads, which is the opposite of living well. And that's what we've created in modern therapy culture, and like we'll have people call in, and certainly it's been intensified post-COVID. Like for a while there, we had like a waiting list of like 500 people we'd never get to because so many people were seeking out therapy. And I just developed a way of like screening through all those people who, just want to do therapy because it's popular or because their friend is doing it.
Right.
And so, the ideas that can be created in that therapy can be really problematic. And you're pulling people into their own minds. We talked about like this rumination process that you can get people to repeat their past over and over again and get stuck on. And now you're like in this cycle of like creating this idea of yourself, and you're experiencing all those negative emotions that are generated from focusing only on the problems that exist in your life, because we've been kind of convinced through like Talkspace and all these other apps, which again, they're businesses. They're trying to get you on their platform. Right. That just talking about your problems is like the most effective way to achieve sound mental health. And that's not true. That's a lie. Sometimes focusing on your problems is the worst thing that you can do in your life. Now, that doesn't mean that there are some situations where you get stuck or some things in your past you have to move on. But like, listen, that's not the way it is now. People think I need to talk about every single problem, and that's where I'm going to feel better. And, there's so many times that I'm in a position where I have to tell somebody, you don't need therapy. This isn't the right path for you.
Wow.
You're doing okay. And people never hear that because like, again, this is the business of it. And there's a book out called Bad Therapy. Abigail Schreier wrote it.
Yeah.
And she interviewed me, and I have a couple quotes in there. But one of the things when I had my conversation with her is, I'm spending a lot of time telling people you don't need therapy, right? You're better served by focusing in on other things in your life that are really meaningful and passionate. And some people get offended by it, right? Yeah. Like I think everyone should have therapy.
Yeah.
No, you're depriving me of something, special. You're going to have to tell people, no, this can be a harmful process for you.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, I that's funny that you were in that book, by the way. I read that book, and I maybe around the same time, maybe like the AI Instagram world we're in fed your feed directly into mine. So like we've also got this at play too. Don't forget. But so there, it's possible that this could be a route potentially for the right person in the right moment. But for the vast majority of people, you've mentioned these words: resiliency, courage. And so if we could land the plane, like how do we become a more resilient person, a more courageous person? And are even those the two like main words you'd use? Like what are those words? What are those characteristics we can pursue, and how do we get those? Or at least start the journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And, first of all, I'm a big believer in family. And so, one of the things, I think we've turned into this expert culture in the United States where like parents don't even trust themselves anymore. And they're getting things off of like some expert or some, media member who's like promoting this new idea about the best way to raise your kids or the best way to do these things. And really, people become paralyzed in fear. And one of the things I have to share with parents, there are parents who seek out consultation from me all the time. And some of the messages that I'm giving to them, I said, nobody knows what's, best for your kid than you. Like it's in your heart. Love is the manner. And let's if you were going to make a loving decision here, right, for the long-term well-being of your kid, what decision you would make? And 99% of the time people come to the right answer. So here's what I would do. First of all, I would abandon public schools' discussion of mental health. Like they would not be able to discuss it, right? Good. Because they're toxic and poisonous ideas, right? Now, would I have things about character, and would I have lessons on like resiliency and strength? Sure, I would. Would I normalize the range of human emotions that people have, like in a science class or a health class? Of course, I would do these things. But they're not in the business of mental health, right? They're not assessing, evaluating, or interacting or shaping a kid's idea about their potential or what they're going through or who they are or any disorder they may have or any doctor they see. They stay the hell out, right? That's you stay away. Now, we communicate, we get back to things in our society about we normalize challenges and we focus on, how to respond to them. Okay. So when people stop turning inward and thinking that there's something broken within them because they feel sad or because they feel anxious, is when we're taking the steps towards resiliency. I was blessed with a father who said, "Yeah, that's hard. What are you going to do about it?" Right? Yeah, life is going to kick you down sometimes. How are you going to get back up? How are you going to respond to this situation? And if you respond to it like through avoidance or escape or fear, you want to take the easy way out? What do you think is going to happen when you take the easy way? So I got all these messages constantly, right?
Yeah.
But, first of all, struggle was normal. I would have I knew that depression existed. First of all, I'm older, so I grew up in a time period where we didn't talk about this stuff. And it's not like, we all were, it was hidden from everybody and the mental health outcomes were much worse. That's not true. That's like what this current generation wants to say is that, like we've come out of the closet and we're speaking about mental health and we're helping people. No, we're creating a whole new reality, right?
Yeah.
I look back historically, I was looking back in like community-based samples in like the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So you're talking about, a time in United States history where there was the Great Depression, there was poverty, there was segregation, and there was war. And there was less than 1% of people would identify themselves being depressed in the past year. So you're saying, about 1% of the population would fall into what they would call melancholy, right? Or really struggle. Now, it's like 1 in 5. So, you go from 1% to 20%. How does that happen? How are we doing better? Right? Because we've cultivated this idea that anything that is emotionally painful means it's a medical condition, it's an episode. We got to get back to that language of suffering and like communicating that, articulating in ways that normalize it. And we build up our capacity to respond, to solve problems. And within that is this belief in who we are, right?
Yeah.
That there's a spirit within us, and we are naturally designed to thrive. And that's a mindset, that's a belief system, right? That's not invalidating somebody. You can validate someone's pain and believe in their ability to respond to it and even get stronger through it. And that's going to serve that person well. But ultimately, listen, we want to improve people's health. You got to love people, right? If someone is truly loved, they're not abused, they're not hurt, they're not abandoned, they're not treated with an emotional distance where we don't feel connected to who they are. That's what I hate about our current mental health and medical system right now. Is you give them a prescription, you send it on your way. You're not attached to that person's outcome. When psychiatrists are interviewed about what would be the first thing that they do for themselves or their kids if they were depressed, they don't say, I'm going to give them a drug.
No, they don't.
They don't. So how do you have to marginalize another person to see the only way that you can get better is by me getting you hooked on a pharmaceuticals? They all create dependence, right? What do you got to do in your mind to make that okay? So we are there's this illusion of separation, and the more distance we become from each other and you don't see God in the other person, well, then that's a path for doing harm. So you see God in everybody, and so love, seeing God in everybody, changing how our culture responds to struggle. Older people, right? The United States treats their elderly like shit, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones that you put in homes and you put on drugs, when they're the ones who've lived the lives. They're the ones who have the wisdom, right? And so we've taken that out of our culture too. When you can travel somewhere else, like to like Eastern cultures or indigenous cultures, and you revere the elderly because they are the most wise. They've been through it. They have to share the messages back to generations. So obviously we're creating a culture of fragility under the disguise of compassion. And what we need to do is build up a culture of strength under real compassion.
Well, who needs the elderly when you've got a 27-year-old TikTok doctor? I mean, we got everything solved, right? We're good. No, I joke, but doctor, that was unbelievable explanation of what's going on. And more than that, it for me personally, this gives me a lot of hope for my future. It gives me a hope for my family's future. It gives me something because this felt like the untouched last frontier to me. I mean, we think about the diet and the health and the exercise, like the big pharma, big food, but then you think about like the mental health aspect and like sort of that last thing. Maybe for you it's the first thing, but for me it's the last thing that I've touched on. And to see that there's hope in this field, that yeah, maybe the emperor has no clothes or whatever, and this is all kind of not true. It's all BS, and we can look forward to a future that builds resilient cultures and a culture community. And I also want to the last thing is how you said, hey, this doesn't just have to be a professional like me. This could be moms and dads. This could be pastors and teachers and coaches that instill resiliency and toughness and character into people. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I played small college football and had sports my entire life, and it was my coaches who gave me these lifelong lessons on so many aspects, and they're the first ones to call me out when I'm not living up to my potential. When you have people around you that love you and care for you, you don't have to go to school for that. You don't have to get a doctorate degree for that. We've created this like false expertise, in our culture. Really, it's my superpower is that I care, and my superpower is that I believe in your innate capacities for greatness, no matter what the challenges exist. And, that can be a teacher, obviously, that should be a parent, that should be coaches, that should be people in your community. And,
That's right.
that's the path forward.
Come on. Doctor, where can people hear more, know more about you online?
So drmcfillin.com is my website, and you can connect to my Substack through there,
Okay.
drmcfillin.substack.com. So I write on these issues too. So I put out like free articles every week and, talking about these concepts. I have a podcast called the Radically Genuine Podcast. You can download that anywhere. That's in the top 1% downloads globally right now. Proud of that. We can speak to these issues, get educated.
Yes.
And you can even contact me through my website. There's ways out there. People reach out with thoughts. I learned a lot from the people who provide feedback. That's a great thing about life, is that when you're really open, is that you're getting lessons from everywhere. People are constantly, there's opportunities to kind of learn and to grow, and that's the great thing about working with people, is that there's wisdom that you're able to glean from your experiences with them. And so people share their stories. I do some consultation work. On Twitter, you can find me, or X now, at Dr. McFillin, and on Instagram at Radically Genuine.
I'm going to put all the links to all those things in the show notes, folks. So if you're on a podcast or YouTube, you can go there and get all the links and connect with Dr. Roger McFillin there. I hope you guys do that. Doc, thanks for being on the show. This is awesome.
Thanks for having me.
One more thing. The statements in this video or audio have not been evaluated by the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Information provided here is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. The information provided by this website and or by this podcast is not a substitute for a physician visit and should not be taken as medical advice of any sort or kind. This is a list of resources for further self-research and work with your personal physician if needed. By using any of this information, by watching, listening, or reading it, you are accepting responsibility for your own health and health decisions, and expressly release this podcast, its participants, and its websites from any and all liability whatsoever, including that which might come from negligence. Also, don't smoke cigarettes, don't do drugs, stay in school, don't touch hot surfaces, and please wear your safety glasses when cutting wood.